The Welsh valley that held their story was no place for the faint in late autumn. Cold pressed down from the mountains in long, low breaths, frosting the stone walls with thin lace each morning. The wind carried the sharp scent of peat smoke and rain-soaked earth. By early November, the sun's path hung low, turning the bramble hedges into silhouettes hours before evening. On the farthest edge of a pasture ringed with hawthorn, a shadow moved with the deliberate weight of age. Rowan stood 17 hands tall, with the deep barrel and heavy bone of his Shire lineage, his black coat thickened against the cold. Feathered fetlocks, now clotted with damp earth, swayed slightly with each shift of weight. A faint hitch in his left hind leg, an old plow injury, gave his gait a slow, measured rhythm, as if each step had to be considered before taken. Some mornings, the mist clung so tightly to the valley that Rowan seemed to emerge from it like a relic of an older time, one when horses like him hauled timber, pulled carts heavy with coal, and measured the day by the sweat on their flanks rather than the ticking of a clock. Even in stillness, there was gravity in him. The crows gave him space when they landed nearby, and the hedgerow wrens darted low to the ground rather than risk his path. He was not alone in that pasture, though the second presence was easy to miss at first. Half the size of a sheep, legs like matchsticks, and a coat the patchy brown of fallen leaves. Pip was a goat kid, and not a healthy one. His ribs pressed visibly against his hide, and his movements were cautious, as if each bound was something he had to remember how to do. In the wild or on a hillside flock, a goat's instinct is to keep moving, to follow the herd to forage. But here, Pip lingered, staying within the shadow line of Rowan's presence, as though it offered more than warmth, it offered safety. Rowan. Juan had seen other animals come and go through the years, sheep driven past in bleating clusters, barn cats weaving under fence rails, jackdaws lifting in sudden clouds when the wind shifted. But this small goat was different. Pip didn't flinch when Rowan's massive head turned in his direction. He didn't scatter when the Shire's breath rose in soft clouds above him. Instead, Pip watched, eyes bright and still, as if waiting for something unspoken to happen. And watching them, from the stone path that led from her kitchen to the pasture gate, was Eleanor Hughes. 62, shoulders slightly hunched against the cold, her wool scarf tucked under her chin, she had been making this short walk twice a day since the previous winter. Feeding Rowan was a ritual that steadied her after her husband's death. He had been the one to bring the horse home nearly 2 decades earlier, a retirement gift to himself from years of teaching. Now Rowan was hers to tend, and the pasture was the one place she could be certain her thoughts wouldn't crowd too loudly. Still, something in the sight of that goat unsettled her. The valley's winters were not forgiving to the small or the sickly, and she knew enough of country life to understand the quiet math at play. Without intervention, Pip would not see the spring bloom. But intervening wasn't simple. Not for a creature that might be wild. Not for a woman who had promised herself she wouldn't take on more to lose. Morning in the valley came slowly, as if light itself had to climb the ridges and push through the gauze of mist that pooled in the low fields. The air was damp enough to taste, metallic from the stone walls, and faintly sweet with the decay of fallen leaves. On the days when the wind slept, the stillness was so complete that the sound of a blackbird's wing could carry across half an acre. This was Rowan's domain, and he knew its every contour. The pasture stretched in a wide curve toward the river, its grass now cropped short by the season, dotted here and there with the yellowed tufts of rushes. Along the northern boundary, a hedge of hawthorn and hazel stood like a weathered guard, its branches bare and twisted, holding the nests of last summer's birds. A narrow gate, its hinges streaked with rust, opened onto a track that led toward the village, though few ever came this way uninvited. The Shire horse moved through the field with unhurried certainty, his hooves pressing half-moon shapes into the soft earth. A Shire's natural gait is long and powerful, bred for pulling loads that would have stalled smaller breeds, but Rowan's was tempered now by the careful pacing of age. His thick winter coat held a sheen even in low light, the black broken only by the splash of white along his face and the feathers cascading over his hooves. In colder months, Shires grow a denser undercoat beneath their outer hair, a natural barrier against wind and rain that let him stand in the open without flinching. Far off, at the field's edge, Pip moved like a shadow made uncertain. Goat kids, even in winter, usually carry a quickness to them, an instinctive readiness to spring from rock, to pivot and bound away at the faintest sign of danger. Pip's movements lacked that ease. He placed each hoof as though testing it, pausing often to flick his ears toward sounds too faint for human hearing, the drip of water from a branch, the scrape of a pheasant shifting in the undergrowth. From her kitchen window, Eleanor could see them both. She liked these before hours, the minutes before she pulled on her boots and stepped into the day's work. The stove's warmth at her back, the glass cool against her fingertips. She watched Rowan graze in the middle distance, his breath curling like smoke. Beyond him, Pip was little more than a pale flicker in the gray. The land itself seemed to hold them in a kind of suspended calm. Here, time didn't rush. The seasons turned on subtler hinges, the way frost clung longer to the shaded grass. The shifting chorus of birdsong, the scent of wood smoke thickening as evenings drew in. Eleanor had lived in this valley most of her life, and understood how it wrapped its own rhythms around those who stayed long enough. Even the animals, she believed, learned to read its moods. On mornings when the mist lay low, Rowan would stand still for minutes on end, his ears rotating slowly, his nostrils flaring to catch scents carried down from the moor. Horses, she knew, could pick up a smell from over a quarter-mile away, a whiff of fresh hay, the musk of a fox, even the faint tang of salt carried inland from the coast when the wind shifted. It was a reminder that for all their domestication, they were still built to survive in a world far bigger and wilder than any paddock. Pip, too, carried that thread of wildness. Goats are browsers by nature, not grazers, and his attention often wandered to the hedgerow. He would rear slightly, stretching his neck to nibble at twigs or the last withered leaves clinging to a branch. In the brief moments when he forgot his caution, there was a glimpse of what he might have been, a creature lithe and curious, designed to pick his way across rocky slopes and high pastures. But those moments never lasted long. A sudden gust rattling the fence rails would send him freezing in place, head high, eyes fixed on Rowan, as though the horse's stillness could tell him whether to flee. More often than not, Rowan would simply lower his head again to graze, the calm passing from one body to the other like a spoken assurance. Eleanor noticed these exchanges even from a distance. She'd seen how animals mirrored each other's comfort or unease, how a settled flock could steady a nervous newcomer. It was part of why she left Pip alone at first. There was a peace in the way he stayed near Rowan without pressing closer, as if he were waiting for some permission neither of them could name. The sky began to lighten by degrees, the clouds thinning to reveal streaks of pale gold along the horizon. In the far hedgerow, a robin landed on a branch, its breast catching the first glint of sun. Rowan shifted his weight, flicked his tail against the chill, and started toward the southern fence line where the grass was a little thicker. Pip followed, keeping the same distance between them, close enough to shadow, far enough to retreat if needed. In those quiet minutes, before the day's decisions pressed in, the valley seemed whole. Eleanor took one last look from the window, then turned toward the hooks by the door where her coat and boots waited. It was time to step outside and join them, to feel the cold air for herself, and to see what the morning might bring. The frost was still clinging to the grass when Rowan reached the far corner of the pasture, his breath puffing in slow, measured clouds. He moved as though each step was an agreement between his body and the earth beneath it, weight shifting, muscles rolling beneath the dense winter coat, one forehoof lifting and planting with quiet certainty. His left hind leg, thick with bone and history, lagged half a beat behind the others, a permanent echo of an injury he had carried for years. In the stillness of the valley, Rowan's presence was a statement. A Shire horse was bred to pull plows and timber wagons, to be the living engine of farms and mills. Even now, long retired, those instincts lived in the lines of his body, the arch of his neck, the deep breadth of his chest, the strength in his haunches. They told the story of generations bred for endurance. But there was no need to prove any of that here. His power was in how little he needed to do to command the space around him. He paused near the fence, lowering his head to graze. His lips moved with a delicate precision that seemed almost at odds with his size. Horses use their sensitive upper lips to feel for the tenderest blades, separating them from the coarse, frost-stiffened stalks. Rowan did it slowly, almost meditatively, his ears turning to track the rustle of a pheasant in the hedgerow and the faint bleat of a sheep in a distant field. Not far off, Pip had stationed himself by a patch of gorse, its spiny green needles offering little but the illusion of shelter. His small body was taut with a kind of readiness, ready to bolt if Rowan moved too suddenly, ready to stand still if Rowan stayed calm. Goats, by nature, are social herd animals. Alone, they feel the press of vulnerability in every shadow, every gust of wind that rattles the undergrowth. For Pip, Rowan was a substitute herd, a towering sentinel whose steady movements created a map of safety. Rowan, for his part, did not seem to mind. There was no flick of irritation in his tail, no flattening of his ears. His awareness of Pip was quiet but constant, like the way he noticed the crows that foraged at the far edge of the field, or the clouds gathering over the ridge. When Pip shifted position, Rowan's ear swiveled toward him. When Pip ventured a step closer, Rowan's head lifted, nostrils flaring briefly, then returned to grazing. The sun, weak but determined, began to warm the upper layer of air. The frost on Rowan's back, fine crystals formed overnight where his breath had risen and settled again, melted into dark, damp patches. Steam rose in thin ribbons from his coat. Eleanor had always loved this sight in winter mornings, how a horse seemed to become part of the valley's weather, exhaling its own mist into the day. She had learned over years of tending him the small signs of his mood, the way his eyes softened when he was at ease, lids lowering just enough to let the light in without strain, the way his breathing slowed almost imperceptibly when the only saikugi-kuskin sounds around him were natural ones, the river's steady rush, the wind brushing over the hilltops, the soft tearing of grass from the ground. In these moments, Rowan seemed more than a retired working horse. He was a presence that anchored the field itself. Pip, though slight and unsure, had already begun to find his own rhythm in that orbit. Goats, unlike horses, are browsers. They seek variety, moving between shrubs, leaves, and stems. Yet Pip lingered longer near the same patches Rowan favored, sometimes lowering his head to mimic the horse's grazing, even if the pickings there were poor. From her vantage point by the gate, Eleanor noticed it all, the subtle mirroring, the way Pip's steps began to match Rowan's pace. She thought of how grief had made her own days mirror one another. Rise, feed Rowan, walk the perimeter, return to the quiet kitchen. And yet, in watching them, there was a suggestion of something shifting. A magpie landed on the fence post near Rowan, its black and white plumage stark against the brown field. Pip's head shot up at the movement, muscles tensing, but Rowan only flicked an ear and shifted his weight. After a moment, Pip's body eased again, his gaze returning to the ground. Trust, Eleanor thought, was sometimes just this, learning what you didn't have to run from. As the morning wore on, the frost retreated to the shadowed corners. The smell of damp earth rose where the sun had touched, mingling with the faint sweetness of hay from the store behind the barn. Rowan began a slow walk toward the water trough, his tail swishing lazily. Pip followed, keeping that careful two-pace distance, his hooves clicking softly against the frozen patches. There was no urgency in their movements, no destination beyond the next patch of grass, the next shared moment of stillness. And in that unhurried pace, in the quiet exchange between them, the valley seemed to hold its breath, not in anticipation of something grand, but in the simple acknowledgement of what already was. By mid-afternoon, the light had shifted to that low, amber slant that came only in late autumn, when the sun seemed to skim the horizon rather than climb it. Shadows stretched long across the pasture, pooling in the dips of the land. The air held the damp weight of rain not yet fallen, carrying the faint tang of peat smoke from somewhere down in the village. It was in this softened light that Pip's condition became harder to overlook. He had been nibbling at a patch of grass near the southern fence, but his movements were slow, almost deliberate in a way that felt unnatural for a goat his age. A healthy kid would dart between food sources, springing with the restless energy built into their wiry muscles. Pip seemed to ration each step, pausing often to rest a hoof on the lowest rail of the fence, as if the effort of standing squarely on all four was too much. From her place by the gate, Eleanor studied him without making her interest obvious. She had seen enough animals in her lifetime to read the subtler signs of decline, the hollows above the eyes, the way the fur lost its lay and began to stand in uneven tufts, the absence of that small belly sway that meant an animal was well fed. Pip's ribs were prominent under the coarse coat, and his hip bones pressed sharp against the skin. Goats, she knew, could be surprisingly hardy in poor weather, their double coats keeping them insulated against damp winds. But nutrition was another matter entirely. Without enough forage, especially in the lean months, muscle and fat reserves dwindled quickly, and once weakened, a goat's ability to regulate body temperature faltered, setting off a quiet chain of vulnerabilities. Still, Pip wasn't lying down in defeat. Even now, his eyes tracked Rowan's every move, his ears flicking toward the horse's slow crunch of grass. Rowan grazed steadily a few yards away, pausing only to shift his stance or flick his tail at an imaginary fly. The old shire seemed to sense the little goat's presence without needing to look. When Rowan moved toward the hedgerow, Pip followed, haltingly but with clear intent, skirting around puddles as though each one were a small hazard. Eleanor felt the weight of the choice pressing in. In country life, there was an unspoken line between what you allowed nature to manage and what you stepped in to change. Wild or stray animals appeared and disappeared according to their own rhythms, and not every intervention ended in a story worth telling. Sometimes, a rescue meant robbing a creature of instincts it needed to survive without you. Yet there was something about Pip's quiet persistence that made turning away feel impossible. He didn't call out. Goats could bleat loud enough to echo across hills, but Pip stayed silent, his needs written only in the way he moved and in the distance he kept. Close enough to shadow Rowan, far enough to stay beyond human reach. A gust of wind swept down from the ridge, rattling the bare hawthorn branches and carrying a scatter of leaves across the field. Rowan barely acknowledged it, but Pip's head shot up, ears rigid, eyes wide. His small body trembled for a moment before he took a hesitant step back toward Rowan. The horse, unmoved, lowered his head again to graze. Slowly, Pip's stance eased, his legs unlocking as if he had taken Rowan's indifference as permission to relax. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The sight stirred something familiar in her, the memory of her own early weeks after her husband's passing, when she'd looked to certain people for cues on how to behave, how to keep going without falling apart. Sometimes it wasn't comfort offered directly that kept you steady, but the calm presence of someone who went about their life without flinching. Above them, the clouds shifted, letting through a patch of pale blue. A shaft of light fell over Pip, catching the pale patch of fur over his left ear. For just a moment, he lifted his head high, sniffing at the air like a creature that still belonged to open hillsides and wild forage. Then his head dropped again, and he returned to picking half-heartedly at the grass. She knew the valley's lean months were just beginning. By January, the ground would freeze in the shaded corners, and even the hedgerows would yield little worth eating. Rowan's feed and hay were secured, but Pip had no such guarantee. Eleanor found herself calculating without meaning to how much extra hay it would take, whether Rowan would tolerate the sharing, how often she could check on them without making the goat wary. Yet for now, she stayed where she was, boots rooted in the damp earth, hands tucked into the pockets of her coat. The decision didn't have to be made today, but the clock had started ticking the moment she'd noticed those hollows above Pip's eyes, and she knew it. In the distance, the river murmured its constant song, oblivious to the quiet negotiations happening in the pasture. The sun slipped lower, gilding the far hilltops and turning the mist to copper. Rowan shifted again, his shadow falling across Pip, and the two of them stood that way until the light thinned to gray. The rain had come overnight, soft but insistent, beating on the kitchen window in 1,000 trembling circles. By morning it had eased into a fine drizzle, the kind that clung to wool and hair without you realizing until the damp had already sunk in. Eleanor stood by the stove, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea, Ia watching the field through the glass. Rowan was where he always was at first light, a dark mass moving slowly through the faded green of the pasture. Pip hovered nearby, still keeping that careful 2-pace distance, his head down in the wet grass. The drizzle had matted the little goat's coat into uneven ridges, and when he lifted his head to look toward Rowan, water clung to the white patch over his ear like a jewel. Eleanor had noticed that he never strayed far from the horse, even when there were more tempting shrubs along the far fence line. She recognized it for what it was: instinct. Herd animals measured their safety in proximity, and even mismatched species could become stand-ins for the real thing. It was a behavior she'd once read about in an old countryside journal. Goats bonding to horses when kept in shared pastures, sometimes so strongly they refused to be separated. She drained the last of her tea and set the mug down, the sound of ceramic on wood small in the hush of the kitchen. Her husband would have commented on the weather, made a joke about the drizzle being more of a suggestion than a proper rain. He had been that way, always able to pull the sting out of gray days. Since he was gone, the silence in the house had grown dense, settling into corners and across tabletops like dust. Pulling on her boots and coat, Eleanor stepped out into the damp. The scent of wet earth rose immediately, mingling with the resinous smell of the old hawthorn hedge. She crossed the yard toward the gate, the drizzle painting the shoulders of her coat in darker patches. The latch gave its familiar groan as she lifted it, and Rowan's ears flicked toward her without his head rising from the grass. She had always found a comfort in tending him. There was a steadiness in the way a horse accepted your presence without requiring words, a conversation carried entirely in weight shifts, ear flicks, and slow breaths. Row. Juan had been part of her life since her husband brought him home, a retirement project, he'd called it, though Eleanor had quickly learned that caring for a shire was more a way of life than a pastime. It was different now, of course. She was alone with the responsibility. The winter feed deliveries, the mucking out, the constant watch for signs of illness, these were her daily markers, and yet they grounded her. Caring for Rowan meant she still belonged to something outside her own thoughts. Pip glanced up as she approached, his eyes quick and assessing. Goats, she knew, had a wide field of vision, almost panoramic, and could spot movement at great distances. He didn't bolt, but his small body tightened, hooves shifting as though he were ready to spring away if she closed the gap. She stopped a few paces short, speaking softly without thinking. "You're a careful one, aren't you?" Her voice was low, the same tone she used with Rowan on restless days. The horse lifted his head briefly, chewing, then turned slightly to put himself between her and Pip, not as a barrier, but as a quiet statement of awareness. From the corner of her eye she saw a figure at the lane. Di Morgan, the neighbor whose family had farmed the next property for generations, leaned against his quad bike. He raised a hand in greeting, then nodded toward Pip. "That one won't last the winter on his own," he called over, voice carrying easily in the still damp air. Eleanor walked toward the fence, resting her arms on the top rail. You think he's wild or got out from somewhere? Hard to say, Di replied. Could have strayed from a small holding, but if he's feral, taking him in might do more harm than good. Sometimes best to let nature sort it. She nodded, though the words sat uneasily with her. She understood the truth in them. She'd seen rescues go wrong when an animal's instincts dulled in captivity. Stita. Watching Pip's thin flanks and the way his eyes tracked Rowan's every move, she wondered what nature had left to offer him here, except a slow fade into the cold months. When Di rode off, the rumble of the bike fading into the drizzle, she turned back toward the pasture. Pip had moved closer to Rowan, their heads angled toward the same patch of grass. The sight sent a faint ache through her chest, something between longing and recognition. She knew too well what it meant to orbit a steady presence, drawing quiet strength from their unshaken routine. The drizzle thickened again, the air sharp with the promise of more rain. Eleanor pulled her coat tighter and stepped back toward the gate. She would feed Rowan shortly, as always, and perhaps she'd scatter a little extra along the fence line, close enough for Pip to find, but far enough that he could take it on his own terms. No decisions yet, just small gestures, the kind that could be taken back if they proved unwelcome. For now, she left them as they were, two creatures bound by something invisible, weathering the damp together in the slow turn toward winter. The next morning broke under a low ceiling of cloud, the kind that flattened the light and pressed the hills closer, as though the valley were a bowl someone had placed a lid upon. The air was sharp with the smell of wet stone, and the grass underfoot released the cold scent of frost melting into soil. Eleanor stood at the gate, hands tucked into her pockets, letting her eyes adjust to the muted palette before her. Rowan grazed in the center of the pasture, his head swinging slowly from side to side, ears flicking to catch the tiny sounds hidden under the constant hush of the river. Pip lingered at the far end, near the southern hedge, half concealed by the tangle of bare branches. The space between them was not wide, but it was deliberate, a gap marked by caution, the kind that could close in an instant or stretch on for weeks. From here, Eleanor could see the faint outline of Pip's ribs beneath his winter coat. Goats, unlike horses, caw, or a little spare weight in their bodies, and in a season when forage is scarce, their frame shows the truth sooner. He shifted his stance, lifting one hoof for a moment before setting it down again, a gesture as small as a sigh. Rowan noticed. He didn't look directly, but his head turned just enough, his left ear angling toward the goat. Then he resumed grazing, his calm presence radiating like a slow heartbeat across the space. For prey animals, body language is everything. The absence of alarm in Rowan's stance was a message Pip could read as clearly as any word. Eleanor rested her arms on the top rail of the gate, feeling the dampness seep through her sleeves. She had fed Rowan already, filling the rubber tub with hay and checking the trough's water level. But she had lingered longer than usual afterward, moving slowly along the fence line with the extra handful of chopped carrots she'd tucked into her pocket. The wind had shifted to carry the scent down toward Pip, and she'd watched from the corner of her eye as he raised his head, nostrils flaring. It was a kind of conversation, though no one would have called it that. She made no move toward him, only let the scent hang in the air between them. He had stepped forward once, 2 small paces, and then stopped, weighing distance against desire. In the end, he'd gone back to the hedge, pulling at the bark of a low branch. That was the thing about first contact, she thought. It wasn't a single moment, but a long series of almosts. Almost close enough to touch, almost willing to take what's offered, almost ready to trust. A gust of wind bent the grass in a ripple across the pasture, carrying with it the damp, metallic scent of rain yet to fall. Rowan lifted his head, blinking slowly. Pip's ears twitched, swiveling toward the sound. The goat took another small step into the open, his gaze fixed on the larger animal as though Rowan's calm alone could guarantee safety. Eleanor stayed very still, She knew goats could distinguish individual humans by face and voice, their memory for both lasting months or even years. If she moved too quickly now, she risked fixing herself in his mind as something to avoid. Better to let the day stretch out with no intrusion, let him keep choosing the distance. Somewhere up the slope, a jay screeched, its harsh call scattering a pair of wood pigeons from the hawthorn. Pip froze, every muscle taut. Rowan turned one ear toward the noise, but didn't move otherwise. After a long moment, the goat's posture eased again, his head dropping to the ground. That relaxation, mirrored between them, was as much a connection as any physical touch could have been. Eleanor shifted her weight, feeling the damp grass give beneath her boots. She thought about Di's words, about letting nature take its course. There was truth in the caution, but also an absence she couldn't name. Nature wasn't a single, neutral force. It was 1,000 small forces colliding, deciding outcomes in ways no one could predict. Her presence here was part of that, whether she acted or not. Rowan moved toward the northern end of the field, hooves sinking slightly into the softened ground. Pip followed at a diagonal, never closing the gap entirely, but matching the direction, the way a younger animal might shadow an elder in a proper herd. The drizzle began again, fine enough to bead on Rowan's mane and dampen the white tuft above Pip's ear. Eleanor stayed until the cold found its way past her coat, down to her skin. As she turned toward the path back to the cottage, she glanced over her shoulder. Rowan had stopped halfway to the fence, head turned just enough to keep Pip in the edge of his vision. Pip stood in the open now, no hedge at his back, the space between them narrower than it had been yesterday. It wasn't trust yet, but it was a step. And in the language of creatures who survive by caution, that was the first word of something that might become a sentence. The sun broke through for the first time in days, spilling across the valley in long, golden strokes that lit the frost like powdered glass. The air was still, the kind of stillness that magnifies every small sound. The creak of a fence post, the whisper of feathers as a blackbird dipped low over the pasture. Eleanor knew before she even reached the gate that something felt different. The field had that rare, delicate atmosphere where change might happen. Rowan stood by the eastern fence line, his body angled toward the rising light. His breath came in slow puffs, curling upward until it vanished into the warming air. Pip was closer than Eleanor had ever seen him, no more than a single pace away from the horse's foreleg. The goat's head was lowered, his eyes half-lidded as if the sun itself were a balm he'd been waiting for. She stayed back, leaning lightly against the gate, not wanting to fracture the moment. Rowan shifted his weight, the thick hair at his fetlocks brushing against Pip's side. The goat didn't flinch. Instead, he took a tentative step nearer, the tip of his muzzle touching Rowan's knee. For an instant, they were still, a great tower of muscle and bone beside a creature so slight it looked as if a strong gust might blow him over. Horses are tactile in their social bonds, mutual grooming, leaning, even the simple act of standing head to tail to swish flies from one another. These are how they affirm connection. Rowan lowered his head, his nostrils flaring as he breathed in Pip's scent. Then, with a gentleness almost too deliberate to be accidental, he brushed his muzzle along the goat's neck. Pip's ears twitched forward, then back, then forward again, as if sifting the gesture for meaning. It was trust expressed in the smallest, simplest form. No to running, not tightening every muscle in readiness to flee, just staying. Eleanor felt something in her chest shift, an easing she hadn't noticed she needed. The months after her husband's passing had been measured in tasks: feed the horse, pay the bills, keep the roof from leaking. Moments like this, moments of unguarded connection, had been rare. Yet here it was, two animals crossing the invisible distance between caution and acceptance, without any coaxing from her. The light grew stronger, warming the air enough that steam rose faintly from Rowan's back. Pip's coat caught the sun, revealing subtle variations in the brown, traces of gold near his shoulders, a darker stripe along his spine. Eleanor knew goats use sight and scent in equal measure when meeting another creature. His calm now meant he'd already learned Rowan's particular smell: hay-sweet, earthy, faintly metallic from the iron in the water trough. A rook cawed overhead, breaking the quiet. Pip's head shot up, ears sharp, but he didn't step away. Rowan stayed still, his bulk casting a shadow over the smaller animal. In that shadow, Pip seemed to settle again, lowering his head until it brushed Rowan's foreleg once more. It struck Eleanor how much of trust was built in these quiet repetitions, one calm reaction layered on another until the instinct to flee softened into the choice to stay. She thought of her own guardedness in recent months, the way she had avoided certain gatherings, certain conversations, because she couldn't yet stand to let anyone too far inside her grief. Watching Pip, she wondered if maybe the work of healing wasn't in a single dramatic opening, but in these incremental leanings toward warmth. The two grazed together for several minutes, moving in slow arcs that kept them within touching distance. Pip's small hooves left shallow prints in the softened earth beside Rowan's larger, deeper ones, like punctuation marks beside long sentences. It was a strange kind of poetry. Different shapes, same path. Eleanor stayed until her fingers ached from the cold gripping the gate. She wanted to fix the image in her mind. The pale winter sun, the breath hanging between them, the unlikeliest pair in the valley standing close enough for warmth to pass between their bodies. This was the kind of moment that wouldn't happen again in quite the same way. Tomorrow, Pip might keep his distance, or he might step closer still. But today was the day of first touch, and she had been there to see it. The first frost that refused to melt came 3 mornings later. It clung to every blade of grass, turning the pasture into a brittle mosaic that crunched softly under Rowan's hooves. The air carried the metallic bite of deep winter's approach, and the low sun offered light but little warmth. Eleanor stood at the gate longer than usual, watching her breath form and drift away, like the questions she hadn't yet answered. Pip was slow to emerge from the shelter of the hawthorn that morning. When he did, the change in him was impossible to ignore. His flanks were narrower, his step more deliberate, as if each movement had been pre-weighed for cost and gain. Goats, she knew, could survive lean conditions better than many livestock, but survival was not the same as thriving. Without richer forage or supplemental feed, the weeks ahead would strip him further. Rowan moved toward the northern end of the field, the frost shattering beneath his weight. Pip followed, still keeping his careful distance, but now with a slight wobble in his gait. Watching them, Eleanor felt a tightening in her chest. The season had drawn its line. The question of whether to act could no longer be postponed without consequence. Inside the cottage, she filled Rowan's feed bucket as she did every morning, the scent of grain and chopped hay rising in a warm, sweet cloud. She set it down by the table wall, and the great horse lowered his head to eat, his mane falling forward in a dark curtain. Out of habit, she glanced toward the hedgerow where Pip lingered. The goat's eyes were fixed on the bucket. He didn't move closer, but his ears flicked forward, catching the faint rustle of feed. It would be so easy, she thought, to carry a smaller portion toward the fence, to scatter it in a patch where he could take it without coming too near. Yet Di's warning echoed in her mind. Sometimes best to let nature sort it. Intervening might bind him to the pasture, to Rowan, to her. And what then, come spring, if his instincts had dulled, if he'd forgotten how to roam and forage? She poured a second bucket, this one half filled, and stood with it cradled in her arms. The cold seeped through the metal, numbing her fingers. She imagined her husband here, his voice warm with certainty. If a creature comes to your door, you feed it. The rest will sort itself. That had been his way. Practical, but never hard. Willing to shoulder the risk if it meant easing another being's hardship. The drizzle returned in the afternoon, turning the frost to slick mud. Pip paced the fence line for a few steps, then retreated to the lee of the hedge. Eleanor took the bucket and walked toward the far corner where the ground sloped slightly upward, providing a dry patch. She set it down just inside the fence and stepped back, folding her arms against the damp chill. Rowan noticed first, lifting his head and swinging his great neck toward her. Pip stayed where he was, his gaze flicking from the bucket to Rowan and back again. The horse moved toward the offering, his bulk blotting out the pale light. But then, as if sensing the unspoken claim, Rowan stopped short, turned slightly, and began grazing elsewhere. It was a small act, but one Eleanor did not miss, space given, without fuss, for another to take. Minutes passed before Pip moved. He advanced in short bursts, stopping each time to test the air, ears swiveling. When he reached the bucket, he sniffed once, twice, and then began to eat, quick, sharp bites as if the feed might vanish if he lingered. Eleanor stayed motionless, the drizzle seeping into her collar, watching the tension in his narrow frame ease with each mouthful. When he was done, Pip stepped back, shook his head once, and looked toward Rowan. The horse remained where he was, content to graze. Between them stretched that invisible thread again, a quiet agreement no one had spoken. Eleanor retrieved the empty bucket and carried it back to the cottage. The choice had been made, she realized, not in that moment, but in all the mornings she'd stood at the gate, weighing his chances against the cold. What she'd done today was only the first step in what would be a longer commitment. Through the window, she saw Pip return to Rowan's side, closer than before, their paths aligned in the dimming light. Whatever the risks, she knew she would not watch him fade alone in the frost. The frost lay thicker that morning, a pale crust that crackled under Eleanor's boots as she crossed the yard. The air had a hard edge to it, sharp enough to sting her nose with every breath. The light was clear and brittle, the kind that seemed to magnify the smallest movements across the field. From the kitchen window she had already seen Pip lingering near Rowan, the gap between them shortened to only a few steps. She carried 2 buckets, one filled with Rowan's usual ration of grain and chopped hay, the other holding a smaller mix of goat feed she'd purchased quietly on her last trip into town. It had taken her 3 days to find a supplier who didn't ask too many questions, and even then she'd felt the need to explain. Stray kid, not sure if he's tame, just want to give him a chance through winter. The shopkeeper had only nodded, as if such half-stories were common enough. At the gate, Rowan lifted his head, the sun catching in his dark mane. Pip's ears flicked toward her, but he didn't retreat. Eleanor set Rowan's bucket down in its usual place, then carried the smaller one to the far corner where the ground sloped dry. Instead of leaving it beyond the fence as before, she unlatched the gate and stepped inside. The sound of the hinge drew both animals' attention. Rowan's ears pricked forward, his eyes following her. Pip froze, his hooves planted firmly, head high. The gate clinked shut behind her, and Eleanor stood still for a moment, letting them measure her presence. She could feel the cold in her fingertips, but she resisted the urge to shove her hands into her pockets. She wanted them visible, empty, unthreatening. Rowan moved first, his hooves sinking slightly into the frost as he crossed to her. He brushed her shoulder with his muzzle, warm breath spilling into the air between them. She reached up, running her fingers through the thick hair of his forelock, murmuring a greeting. Pip watched, his weight shifting subtly from one front hoof to the other, a sign, she knew, of uncertainty rather than fear. She crouched, placing the smaller bucket on the ground. The goat feed carried its own scent, sweet with molasses, grainy underneath. Pip's nostrils flared. Rowan glanced at it but made no move, instead returning to his own bucket. It took nearly 5 minutes for Pip to approach. He did it in stages, stepping forward, pausing to look at her, then forward again. His eyes never left hers, even when his nose reached the rim of the bucket. The first mouthful was tentative, but the second came quicker, and by the third he was eating steadily. From this close, Eleanor could see the coarseness of his coat, the way it broke unevenly over his shoulders. His spine stood a little too proud beneath the skin, his tail thin at the base. But there was Lato, if in him still. alertness in his eyes, a readiness in the set of his legs. He was not yet defeated. The wind shifted, carrying the sound of a tractor somewhere up the lane. Pip's head shot up, ears forward. Rowan glanced toward the noise but kept chewing. Pip hesitated, then lowered his head again to eat. It was a small thing, but to Eleanor it felt like a hinge moment. Trust transferred by example, one creature showing another how to read the world. When the bucket was empty, Pip stepped back but didn't bolt. He lingered near her, watching as she straightened. She didn't reach for him. Instead, she adjusted the bucket in her hands and walked slowly back toward the gate. Pip followed for a few paces, stopping when Rowan moved to stand between them. Outside the fence, she latched the gate and turned to see them standing together, Rowan's great shadow falling across the smaller animal. The frost was beginning to soften where the sun touched it, releasing the faint mineral smell of thawing earth. Inside the cottage, she set the buckets by the door and peeled off her gloves. Through the window, she could still see them, two figures in the pale light, moving slowly across the pasture, their paths weaving close enough that the space between seemed less like distance and more like choice. It had taken weeks to get here, weeks of measured steps, of waiting for the moments when caution tipped just enough toward curiosity. Today, the gate had opened, not just in the fence, but in the quiet language they were beginning to share. The first real snow came at the turn of the month, drifting in overnight and muffling the valley under a white stillness. Eleanor woke to a sky the color of unpolished pewter, the air so heavy with frost that her breath clouded the kitchen window as she leaned in to look. The pasture was transformed. No visible grass, only a rolling expanse broken by the day. Arc shapes of Rowan and Pip. Rowan stood near the water trough, his broad frame dusted with snow like sifted flour. He stamped once, breaking the thin crust of ice forming at the edges. Pip was closer to the fence than she had ever seen him at first light, his small hooves leaving a chain of delicate prints in the snow. He lifted his head toward Rowan when the horse moved, as if taking instructions from his posture. Eleanor knew the weeks ahead would test them all. Snow meant no grazing worth the name. Even hardy breeds would lose weight without steady feed. She pulled on her thickest coat, gloves stiff with the cold, and stepped out into the sharp air. The sound was different today. Snow absorbed it, muting the usual rush of the river and the faint creak of the fence. Even her boots on the packed path made a duller sound. At the barn, she filled Rowan's bucket with a mixture richer than usual: oats, chopped hay, and a sprinkle of the carrot pellets he favored. Beside it, she prepared Pip's ration, measuring carefully from the sack she'd stored in a lidded bin. The molasses in the feed had stiffened in the cold, releasing a scent that cut through the frozen air. When she reached the pasture, Rowan greeted her with a low rumble in his throat, a sound she'd learned was reserved for moments of anticipation. Pip stayed back but didn't retreat to the hedgerow. She set Rowan's feed down first, then carried Pip's to a sheltered dip in the ground where the snow had drifted thinner. The goat approached more quickly than he had in days past, his tracks a neat scatter in the snow. He stopped only a yard from her, the breath from his nostrils curling into the cold between them. She stepped back, letting him have the space, and watched as he dipped his head into the bucket. His coat looked thicker now, the coarse guard hairs rising against the weather, but under the winter layer she could still see the lines of his ribs when he bent. A healthy goat in cold weather spends much of its energy maintaining body heat, and every calorie mattered. She made a mental note to increase his portion slightly, enough to give him that margin without making him dependent too quickly. Rowan finished his feed and wandered over, snow crunching under his heavy steps. Pip didn't lift his head until Rowan stopped beside him, then gave a brief shake, as if to dislodge any thought of surrendering his meal. Rowan lowered his head, sniffed the rim of the bucket, and stepped away without contest. The quiet deference was as striking as the snow, an unspoken permission given again and again. Later that morning, Eleanor worked along the fence line, knocking snow from the top rails where it had gathered into long ridges. Pip followed at a distance, occasionally rearing onto his hind legs to nibble at exposed twigs. Rowan kept a steady pace behind, as though her route was worth shadowing. By midday the sky had begun to clear, a pale wash of blue showing between stretched veils of cloud. Sunlight glazed the snow, making it sparkle as if scattered with ground glass. In that brightness, the animal's breath looked almost like smoke from small fires. Back inside, she warmed her hands around a fresh mug of tea and watched them from the window. Pip stood pressed lightly against Rowan's side, both facing into the low sun. It was the kind of contact that had once been unthinkable, now given without hesitation. The snow would crust overnight, she knew, making movement harder, feed more urgent. But for now, the scene outside held a quiet order. The great black horse and the small brown goat, two bodies anchored in the whiteness, the space between them gone as if it had never existed. Winter was only beginning, and the work would deepen with it. Yet in their steady companionship there was a rhythm she could trust, measure, patient, enough to see them through whatever the next storm would bring. By late January, the valley had settled into the deep quiet of midwinter. The snow came and went in cycles, one day a blinding white glare, the next a patchwork of frozen ground and sodden earth. The hedgerows stood bare, their thorny skeletons etched against the pale sky, and the air carried that faint mineral scent of thawing soil. Days were still short, but Eleanor could feel the light lingering just a little longer each evening, as if promising that winter would not hold forever. Rowan and Pip had changed in ways that were both obvious and subtle. Pip's ribs no longer stood out like the bars of an empty gate. His coat had grown thick and weatherproof, the darker stripe along his spine more defined now, catching the light when he turned. His movements had gained a quiet energy. He no longer picked his way as though each step was a decision, but walked with the sureness of one who knows he belongs. Rowan, too, seemed altered. The old Shire had always carried himself with dignity, but there was a new attentiveness in him, ears swiveling more often toward the goat, steps adjusting slightly to keep their paths close. Horses are by nature creatures of habit, but Eleanor could see how his routines had shifted. He no longer grazed the far field alone, no longer stood for long stretches without company. Eleanor's own days had reshaped themselves around the two of them. Feeding was no longer just a matter of filling buckets. It was a daily measure of how much Pip was eating, whether Rowan was leaving him room, how the weather might change the day's needs. She had found herself talking to them more, not in the one-sided way of filling silence, but in the tone of someone who expects to be understood on some level beyond words. There were moments now when Pip came to meet her at the gate. He never rushed, just a quiet, deliberate walk until he was a few feet away, eyes brightened. Steady. Once, when a cold wind came hard from the north, he had even let her touch the side of his neck as she set down his bucket. His muscles had tensed at first, but he hadn't stepped back. That contact, fleeting as it was, had stayed with her for days. The rhythm of their bond was clear in the smallest exchanges. Rowan would finish his feed and stand nearby while Pip ate, the great horse's head lowered as if keeping watch. If a sudden noise came from the lane or the far slope, both would turn together, ears forward, bodies angled toward the source. When the tension passed, they would resume as one, grazing, shifting position, moving toward the shelter of the hedge. One morning, a thin rain fell, fine enough to beat on coats and hair without soaking. Eleanor watched as Pip stood alongside Rowan, their bodies almost touching. Rowan flicked his tail idly, and the movement brushed across Pip's side. The goat didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned slightly into the contact, as if the casual swish were a comfort. It was not the kind of thing that could be forced or faked. It was the language of shared space, learned over weeks of unbroken presence. For Eleanor, these changes had carried their own quiet effect. The sharp edges of her grief had dulled, replaced by something less jagged, more bearable. She found herself noticing the small beauties of the valley again, the way frost crystals formed intricate patterns on the stable latch, the soft wicker Rowan made when he spotted her crossing the yard, the sound of Pip's hooves on the frozen ground. Even the neighbors had remarked on it. At the post office, Di had said, "That little goat's taken to your big lad, hasn't he?" It hadn't been a question so much as an observation, offered without judgment. Eleanor had only nodded, but inside she'd felt a quiet pride. The season was still against them, but there was strength now where there had been fragility. Pip's wariness had not vanished. He was still quick to step back if she moved too suddenly. But it no longer felt like a wall, only a gate that opened and closed with care. Rowan's patience seemed boundless. And in that patience, Pip had found the space to grow into something sturdier, more sure-footed. When evening fell, the light softening into the rose-gray that winter evenings carried, she stood at the kitchen window and watched them side by side, their breath rising in tandem. The valley was quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't feel empty anymore. It felt lived in, shared. Change, she thought, didn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes it was the slow accumulation of days when things went right, when food was found, warmth was kept, and no one had to stand alone in the cold. The first true thaw arrived in early March, announced not by sunshine, but by the sound of water. Thin streams ran down from the hillsides, weaving through the pasture in glistening threads. The air lost its bite, carrying instead the damp, rich smell of waking earth. Frost still clung in the shaded corners, but each day it receded, giving way to small shoots of green that seemed to rise overnight. Eleanor knew the season's turn meant another change. The small holding on the next ridge, owned by a young couple raising a mixed herd of goats, had agreed to take Pip in. They had the space, the forage, and most importantly, the company of his own kind. She'd walked the property herself, running her hands over the sturdy fencing, watching the herd graze and butt heads in playful scuffles. It was the right choice. She could see that. But knowing it was right didn't soften the weight of it. The morning of the move was mild, with low, fast-moving clouds scattering the light. Rowan stood near the gate, his great head lowered as Pip pressed close against his shoulder. It wasn't the cautious shadowing of those early weeks. This was comfortable proximity, the kind shared without thought. Eleanor watched them for a long moment before unlatching the gate. The couple arrived with a small trailer bedded thickly with straw. Pip eyed it from a distance, ears twitching. Goats dislike confinement, and she'd expected him to balk. But when Rowan shifted and began walking toward the open ramp, Pip followed a few steps before stopping, looking between the horse and the humans. She crouched near the bucket she'd set on the ground, filled with the sweet-smelling feed he favored. Rowan stayed just behind her, his breath warm against the back of her coat. Pip hesitated only a moment longer before stepping forward to eat. The couple moved quietly, one closing the small gap to guide him gently up the ramp, the other ready at the latch. Pip's hooves made a soft, hollow sound on the wooden floor, and then he was inside. Rowan's head lifted, ears pricked. He stepped closer to the trailer, exhaling in a slow, audible breath. Pip turned inside, meeting the horse's gaze through the open slats. For a long heartbeat, neither moved. Then Pip gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of his head, the same gesture he'd made on cold mornings when Rowan's stance told him all was well. Eleanor felt something shift in her throat, too thick for words. She rested her hand on Rowan's shoulder, feeling the slow, steady rise and fall of his breathing. "He'll be all right," she murmured, unsure if she was saying it for Rowan or herself. When the latch clicked shut and the trailer began to move, Pip shifted to keep his gaze fixed on the horse until the last possible moment. Just before the bend in the lane took them out of sight, he looked back, not startled, not calling out, just a final searching glance that landed on both of them. The yard felt larger after they were gone, the space between Rowan and the hedge suddenly unoccupied. Rowan stayed by the gate for a while, ears flicking toward the lane, before finally turning away to graze. Eleanor lingered beside him, letting the quiet settle. The bond between those two had been wordless and unhurried, built in the spaces between feeding and sheltering, in the shared stance against wind and frost. It had been enough to change them both, and she realized her as well. That evening, the valley seemed to hold a softer light. The hedgerows were beginning to bud, the blackbird's song carrying further now that the wind had eased. Rowan grazed near the center of the pasture, pausing often to lift his head toward the ridge where the small holding lay. Eleanor found herself smiling at the thought of Pip among his new herd, carrying with him the lessons learned in this field. That safety can be found beside the most unexpected companion, that patience can bridge distances no map can measure. If you believe healing can happen in silence and stillness, subscribe now to join others who've witnessed quiet miracles. Tell me in the comments, who or what helped you heal when you needed it most?